It was early morning when Farmer Dan stepped out of his old wooden house. The sky was gray. The ground was still wet from last night's rain. He stretched his arms, took a deep breath, and walked toward the barn like he did every day. But something was wrong today. Something strange. Near the corner of the barn, beside the broken fence, he saw an old brown sack. At first, he thought it was just trash someone threw on his land. But then, it moved, not from the wind, not by accident. It twitched, just a little, like something inside was trying to get out. Dan stopped, confused, his boots sinking slightly in the wet dirt. He stared at the sack for a few seconds, waiting, watching. Then it moved again, sharper this time, a soft bump from inside. His heart skipped. Could it be an animal? Maybe a trapped cat or dog, or worse, a coyote pup. He walked closer, slow and careful. The sack was tied at the top with a dirty black cord. There were strange stains on the cloth. Green, not red, not brown. He had never seen blood like that before. A chill ran down his back. Dan leaned down, put one hand on the sack, and felt a weak shiver from inside. "Easy now," he whispered. "I'm not gonna hurt you." With one pull, he untied the knot. He opened the sack and froze. Inside was not an animal, not a child, not anything he had ever seen before. It was a girl, small, thin, with greenish skin that shimmered slightly in the morning light. Her arms were covered in scratches and bruises. Her hair looked like silver wires, long and tangled. She wore torn clothes made of thin metallic cloth. Her knees were pulled to her chest, her body shaking from cold or fear, or both. Dan stepped back in shock, nearly falling. "What in the world?" he muttered. The girl looked up slowly, her eyes glowing soft blue, like dim stars. She opened her mouth, her voice weak and cracking. "Please," she whispered, "don't send me back." Then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed. Dan stood frozen for a moment, trying to breathe, trying to think. He had never seen an alien before, not in real life, only on screens. But this girl, she wasn't a threat. She looked hurt. Hungry, broken. "Hell," he muttered, pulling off his coat. He wrapped it around her carefully, gently lifting her out of the sack. She was light, lighter than she should be, like she hadn't eaten for days. He carried her into his house, placing her gently on the couch. The warmth of the fire slowly touched her face. Dan stared at her, wondering what to do. Call someone, maybe the government, the news, the army. But as he looked at her bruises, the fear on her face when she said those words, he decided something quietly in his heart. He would not let anyone take her. Not yet. He brought a blanket, tucked her in, made a bowl of soup just in case she woke up. Then he sat in the nearby chair, watching her, waiting. Minutes passed, maybe hours. She didn't move, only breathed softly, like a broken thing finally finding rest. Outside, the wind picked up, and the trees near the barn shook. The chickens made nervous noises. The cows mooed low. Dan stood up and went to the window, pulling the curtain aside. In the distance, near the tree line, something shimmered. Just for a second, like a figure too tall to be human, watching. Dan's heart raced. He turned quickly, grabbed the old rifle hanging above the fireplace. It was rusty, hadn't been fired in years. Still, he held it tight and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit his face, but he didn't care. He looked at the trees, at the shadows, but saw nothing now. Maybe it was his imagination, or maybe not. He returned inside, locked the door, bolted the windows, then walked back to the couch where the girl lay, still breathing, still silent. He sat down again and whispered to himself, "What the hell have I just brought into my home?" But somewhere deep inside, a strange feeling was growing. Not fear, not fully, something else, something heavier. He didn't know her name, where she came from, or what she had escaped, but one thing was clear. Someone had thrown her away like trash, and someone else might come looking for her. Dan looked down at the girl, her face finally calm under the blanket, and he made a quiet promise. No matter who she was, or what danger followed, he would not let anyone hurt her again. The morning light crept through the window, slow and soft. Dan was half asleep in the chair, his neck sore, his back stiff. The fire had turned to warm embers, and silence filled the small farmhouse. Then he heard it, a sharp breath, fast, frightened. He opened his eyes, and there she was. The alien girl was awake, sitting up slowly on the couch, her eyes wide with panic. She looked around, confused and scared, clutching the blanket like it was armor. Dan stood slowly, careful not to startle her. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe here." But she didn't believe him. She shrieked, a high-pitched sound that made Dan wince. Then she rolled off the couch and crawled fast under the wooden table. Her breathing was loud, shallow, like someone drowning in fear. Her hands trembled and her eyes flicked from corner to corner. Dan raised his hands, palms out, his voice calm. "I won't hurt you," he said. "You were outside, cold, in a sack. I brought you in, that's all." She stared at him, not blinking. Then her lips moved, and she spoke, slow, broken words. Where am I?" she asked, her accent heavy, her voice cracked. "My name's Dan," he replied. "This is my farm, and you're safe now." She didn't answer, but her eyes searched the room. She pointed to the window, her body curling tighter. "Dark ones," she whispered, "followed me." Dan's chest tightened. Dark ones. That sounded bad. Very bad. He stepped back, giving her space. "There's no one out there now," he said gently. "Just me and you. I gave you soup, this, and rest. You were hurt." The girl didn't respond, but her body slowly loosened, just a little. Dan saw how thin she was, her bones showing beneath her strange skin. Her wrists had bruises, dark purple and green, like she had been tied for a long time. Her feet were bare, her ankles raw. "I won't call anyone," Dan said, like a promise. "No army, no police. Just tell me who you are if you can." She blinked, then whispered something. A name maybe, or a word. It sounded like Kira or Kira. He wasn't sure. He repeated it, and she nodded slowly. "Are you from a ship?" he asked. She looked down, then nodded once more. Dan's heart pounded. He was right. She was not from Earth, not just in appearance, but in pain, in fear, in silence. She wasn't just lost. She was running. He went to the kitchen, picked up the bowl of soup, still warm. He crouched low and slid it across the floor toward her. She flinched as it came near, sniffed it like a frightened animal. Then, with shaky hands, she lifted the spoon, tasted one drop. Her eyes widened. She ate more, faster now, like someone who hadn't felt kindness in a very long time. Dan watched her, not speaking. He couldn't understand her story fully, but one thing was clear. Someone had treated her like trash, and she didn't trust anyone now. Suddenly, she stopped eating, looked behind him, and gasped. Dan turned fast, instinct kicking in, but nothing was there. Only shadows dancing from the firelight. She whispered, "They see. Through fire." Dan didn't know what that meant, but he took no chances. He grabbed the poker and spread the ashes, dimming the flames, making the room darker. She relaxed a little, still under the table, still watching him like a cornered animal. "I won't let them hurt you," Dan said again, this time louder, stronger. "I don't know who they are, but you're not going back." She dropped the spoon, crawled out just a little, her knees trembling. Then she pointed to a scar on her neck, shaped like a tiny square. "Tracker," she said. Dan leaned in, shocked. "Is that how they find you?" She nodded, then tried to claw at it with her nails, panicked again. No, don't hurt yourself," Dan said, holding her hands gently. "I'll help you remove it, I swear." Her eyes filled with tears. "No one helps," she said quietly. "No one stays." Dan's throat felt dry. "Well, I'm not no one," he said. "I'm just a farmer, but I've seen enough cruelty in this world. I don't care what planet you're from. You're not an object. You're a person." The girl stared at him, her lips trembling. For a second, something changed in her eyes, like a tiny spark of hope trying to live again. Then she collapsed forward, exhausted, the food finally giving her a little strength, but her body giving out. Dan caught her, gently carried her back to the couch. This time, she didn't fight him. He wrapped the blanket around her again, but his mind raced. A tracker, someone chasing her, strange watchers near the trees. This was bigger than just an accident. This girl had escaped from something terrifying, and now that terror might come to his door. Still, Dan looked down at her peaceful face and whispered, "You're not going back, Kira. Not while I'm alive." The wind had changed. Dan could feel it in the air. Colder, heavier. It was almost midnight, and the sky above his farmhouse looked wrong. Clouds didn't move, and the stars above seemed too still, too sharp. Inside the house, the alien girl, Kira, was sleeping again. Her breathing was soft. Her body finally relaxed under layers of blankets. Dan sat in the kitchen with his old mug of coffee, untouched, cold. His shotgun rested beside the door, though he knew it wouldn't help much if something truly alien came. He couldn't sleep, not after what she had said. Dark ones, tracker, see through fire. These weren't just words from a scared girl. They were warnings. Suddenly, the lights in the kitchen flickered. Dan stood up fast. Heart racing. The light blinked once, twice, then died. The refrigerator hummed for a second, then went silent. The power was gone. Dan walked to the window slowly, trying not to make noise. He peeked through the curtain and froze. In the far corner of his field, near the barn, a soft blue light was pulsing. It wasn't from a car, or a drone, or anything human. It glowed in slow waves, bright, dim, bright again. Something, or someone was there. He turned back to check on Kira. She was awake, eyes wide, trembling already. "They found me," she whispered, her voice like cracked glass. Dan ran to her, crouched beside the couch. "How many?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head. "Don't know, but they always come at night." Dan helped her up, guiding her to the trap door near the back of the house. The storm cellar, deep underground, was cold but hidden well. "Stay here, don't make a sound," he said, "no matter what you hear." She clutched his sleeve, her eyes pleading. "They don't knock, they burn." Dan nodded, then shut the trapdoor gently, locking it from above. He grabbed the shotgun again, even though it felt useless. Then he stepped outside, into the dark. The sky was quiet, too quiet. Even the animals were silent. No owls, no crickets, no wind. Dan walked slowly toward the barn, the blue light now glowing steady. As he got closer, he saw them. 3 tall figures, half shadow, half machine. Their bodies shimmered, their faces hidden behind masks with glowing red lines. Dan hid behind a haystack, watching, holding his breath. One of them knelt near the sack where Kira had been found. The other 2 scanned the ground, using devices that clicked and hummed. Then one turned sharply toward the house. Dan froze. The figure lifted a hand, and a strange beam of light scanned the distance between them. Dan ducked, heart pounding in his ears. But the figure didn't move. "See, loser." It turned back and said something in a strange language. A moment later, all 3 disappeared, swallowed by a flash of cold white light. Dan waited a full minute before moving. He walked slowly back to the house, every step careful, quiet. He unlocked the trap door and helped Kira climb out. "They were here," he said, "but they didn't break in." Kira shook, her knees weak. "They didn't need to," she whispered. "They left a marker." Dan looked confused. "What marker?" he asked. She pointed toward the barn window. Dan walked out again, flashlight in hand. On the ground near the barn door, something glowed. A strange circle drawn in ash, with symbols he couldn't read. It pulsed like a heartbeat, then faded slowly. He returned to the house, jaw clenched. "They'll come again," Kira said, stronger. Dan stared at her, then at the door. "Then we'll be ready," he said firmly. "You're not alone now." She looked at him, surprised. "No one fights them," she said. "Everyone runs." Dan shook his head. "Well, I'm not everyone." They sat in silence, the fire now burning low again. Dan watched the flames dance across Kira's tired face. He saw something new in her eyes, not just fear, but a spark of trust, small and flickering, but real. She didn't belong to Earth, and he didn't belong to her world. But at that moment, They shared something deeper, a choice to stand together. Outside, the wind returned, but now it whispered warnings, and far above the stars blinked. Watching. The morning sun came late that day. Thick clouds covered the sky, and the light felt cold, not warm. Dan stood by the sink, staring out the window. The symbol near the barn had vanished, but the fear hadn't. Behind him, Kira sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of broth. She hadn't spoken much since the night visit. Her eyes stayed low, her shoulders tight, but Dan knew the silence couldn't last forever. He needed to know what he was protecting her from. He turned and asked quietly, "Who are they, Kira?" She didn't answer, not at first. Then slowly, she pulled up her sleeve, showing the scarred skin on her wrist. 2 deep marks, like something had pierced through her flesh and burned it closed. Dan sat down across from her. Her voice was soft, almost shaking. "They call it a bind tag," she said. "It's how they mark property." Dan's hands curled into fists under the table. "Property," he said, his voice rough. "You mean like slaves?" She nodded slowly, not meeting his eyes. "I was taken when I was little, from my moon village," she said. "We were peaceful. They came with lights, promises, then chains." Dan listened, heart heavy. "I worked in mines, then ships, then labs," she continued. "They passed me from hand to hand, like I was nothing. Some masters were cruel," she whispered, "some just cold. But none saw me as a person." Her fingers touched the back of her neck, where a thin line of metal peeked from her skin. "This is a tracker," she said, "buried deep, hard to remove. They know when I breathe." Dan stood up suddenly, walked to his shed, and came back with a toolbox. She watched with wide eyes as he opened it. "You're gonna cut it out?" she asked, her voice shaking. Dan shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm not a surgeon, but I can build something." He pulled out a small scanner from an old drone, rewired it, and connected it to a screen. After a few minutes of work, he held it near her neck. The screen flashed red, then showed a blinking dot exactly under her skin. "That's the bug," he said. "They're watching you even now." Kira looked like she would faint. She backed away, hands covering her face. "Then I should go," she said. "I'll only bring death here." But Dan stepped forward and placed his hand on her shoulder. "You're not leaving," he said firmly. "We'll remove it or block it or crush the signal. I've built stronger machines than this." She looked up at him, her lips trembling. "No one's ever tried to help me," she said. Dan gave a small smile. "Then it's about time someone did." That afternoon, Dan worked in the barn. He built a blocker using old metal, wire, and a solar battery from a broken harvester. Kira watched from a distance, her arms wrapped around her knees. For the first time, she felt something warm, not from the fire, not from the soup, but from the way Dan treated her, like a person who mattered. When the blocker was ready, he told her to sit under it. He turned it on, and the scanner blinked once, then stopped. "No signal," Dan whispered, smiling. Kira gasped softly, touching her neck. "I'm invisible," she whispered, "to them." But the joy didn't last long. That night, as they sat by the fire, Kira spoke again. "There's something else you should know," she said, her voice flat. Dan looked at her carefully. She stared into the flames and continued. "They didn't just use me for work," she said. "They experimented." Dan's breath caught. "On your body?" he asked. She nodded. "On my mind too," she said. "They tried to make me obedient. They used sounds, drugs, machines. Sometimes I forget things, forget who I am." Dan's heart ached. "You remember now," he said softly. She looked at him, eyes wet. "I remember you gave me soup," she whispered. "I remember you didn't yell. That's more than anyone's given me in years." Silence filled the room, heavy like a storm. Then Dan said gently, "You're not broken, Kira. You're healing." She wiped her tears, then gave a weak smile. Dan stood up and placed another log on the fire. "We'll fight them," he said. "But first, we fix you." Outside the wind howled again, but this time, Kira didn't flinch. For the first time, the chains inside her heart began to break, not with force, but with kindness. The next morning started quiet. Too quiet. Birds didn't sing, the cows didn't moo, and even the wind had vanished. Dan stepped outside with a cup of coffee, but something in the air felt wrong. Still, he tried to act normal, not wanting to. Scare Kira again. She sat near the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, her silver hair glowing softly in the pale light. She looked up at the sky, her face tense. "Something's coming," she whispered. Dan followed her gaze, but saw nothing but gray clouds and cold sky. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I feel it, in my bones." Dan didn't question her, not anymore. She had been right too many times. He walked to the barn and double-checked the blocker device he had built. The scanner still showed no signal. But he didn't trust it fully. The syndicate, whoever they were, had tech far beyond anything on Earth. That afternoon, Dan went into town to buy supplies. He didn't tell anyone about Kira, just kept his head low, bought what he needed. Batteries, canned food, water filters. He felt eyes on him the whole time, like shadows behind every door. When he returned, Kira was waiting on the porch, her hands shaking. "It's in the sky now," she said. Dan frowned and looked up, and then he saw it. At first it looked like a cloud, but it wasn't. It hovered without moving, no wings, no sound, no reflection, just a large black shape, floating above the tree line beyond the field. "What is that?" Dan whispered. Kira's voice cracked. "It's a drone scout." They found the general area. Now they search for heat, movement, energy. Dan pulled her inside quickly, shut all curtains, turned off every light. He even unplugged the fridge and turned off the breaker switch. The house became still and dark, like a ghost home. Only the ticking of an old clock could be heard. Kira paced slowly, breathing fast. Dan held her shoulders and looked her in the eyes. "We're not giving up now," he said. "You hear me? You're not going back to them." She nodded, but tears filled her eyes. "They don't take people back," she whispered. "They erase. If I'm caught, I disappear." Dan's jaw tightened, his heart burning with anger. No, he wouldn't let that happen. Not on his land, not under his roof. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old walkie-talkie. Years ago. He used it during storms and emergencies. He turned it on and spoke into it softly. "Base to any nearby farmer. You copy." No answer came, only static. Then, suddenly, the static shifted, twisted, and turned into something else. A voice, but not human. Cold, flat, emotionless, it said, "Surrender the subject." Dan's eyes widened. They had hacked the signal. Kira froze in place, her mouth slightly open. The voice repeated, "Surrender the subject, and no damage will come to the location." Dan turned off the device and looked at her. "I'm not surrendering anything," he said, his voice calm but firm. Kira stepped back, afraid. "You don't understand," she said. "If you don't give me to them, they'll destroy everything." Dan stepped closer. "I don't care," he said. "They'll burn the farm, fine. They'll ruin my life, fine. But I won't let them touch you. No one who treats someone like trash gets to win." Kira sank to the floor, shaking. "No one ever chose me over safety before," she whispered. Dan knelt beside her. "Then let this be the first time," he said, "because I won't change my mind." Outside, the sky had turned darker. The black shape was still above the trees, but now smaller lights dropped from it. Drones maybe, or scanners, slowly circling the area. Dan knew they didn't have much time. He grabbed his tools and started preparing the storm cellar again. But this time, he added food, heat packs, and even a radio. "If things go bad," he said to Kira, "you stay in here and don't come out." "What about you?" she asked, voice shaking. Dan looked at her, calm but tired. "I'll keep them busy," he said. "I've got a few tricks left." That night, they didn't sleep. Kira sat in the cellar, hidden and quiet. Dan sat on the porch, shotgun across his lap, eyes on the sky. The black ship above made no sound, but its presence screamed danger. And then, just past mid-ice night, a single beam of red light shined down on the field. A scan, slow and sweeping. Dan didn't move, didn't blink. The game had started, but he wasn't going to lose. Not tonight. Not while she was still under his roof. Not while he still had breath in his lungs. The red beam scanned the fields like a giant eye in the sky. Slow, steady, and cold. Dan didn't move a muscle as it passed over him. He sat on the porch, still as a stone, shotgun resting across his knees. He wasn't afraid anymore, only angry. Inside the storm cellar, Kira sat curled in a corner. Her breathing was fast, her heart beating like a drum. She had seen that beam before. It meant one thing: capture or destruction, no middle ground. Dan stood slowly as the beam faded. He looked up at the ship, still hovering without sound. Then he walked into the barn, shut the door behind him, and got to work. He didn't have alien tech, but he had tools, wires, fuel, and experience. Years ago, before farming, Dan had served in Earth's last border war. He didn't talk about it, didn't wear medals, but the skills never left him. Now he would use them again, not for a nation, but for one girl who needed protection. He rigged barrels of diesel near the edges of the field, connected them to old spark igniters. He placed sharpened spikes under tarps, hidden in grass. He set up motion-triggered flares and tripwires using broken fence wire and old fireworks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the syndicate feel unwelcome. At dawn, Kira climbed out of the cellar, pale and shaking. "You didn't run," she said, her voice small. Dan looked at her with calm eyes. "I don't run from bullies," he said, "especially ones who treat people like cargo." She stared at him, unsure if he was brave or mad. Maybe both. But for the first time in her life, someone stood for her, not over her, and that gave her strength. Dan handed her a small tool. "I need your help," he said. "Can you disable this tracker completely?" She looked at the blocker device and nodded. "With enough time, yes." "Then start now," he said. "I'll buy us that time." That evening, just after sunset, the black ship moved again. 3 smaller crafts dropped silently from its underbelly. They looked like sharp birds made of glass and shadow. They landed at the far edge of the field, near the old scarecrow. Dan watched from the barn window, heart steady. The syndicate had arrived. 3 tall figures stepped out of the crafts, dressed in black armor, helmets glowing faint red. They walked with purpose, no fear, no emotion. One of them scanned the ground and spoke in a strange tongue. Then they moved forward, slowly, methodically. Dan whispered to himself, "Welcome to Earth," and pulled the ignition switch. A fireball exploded on the far side of the field. The fuel barrel lit up the sky like lightning. The syndicate soldiers stopped, confused for the first time. One stepped forward and triggered a tripwire. A second blast went off, this one filled with burning flash powder. The red lights on their suits blinked wildly. Dan grinned. "Not so smart without your ship doing all the thinking, huh?" But they adapted quickly. One aimed a weapon and fired a bolt of light that burned through a tree. Dan ducked and ran to the next spot, throwing a flare toward the second trap zone. Another boom echoed as one of the soldiers was thrown backward into the dirt. Inside the house, Kira worked fast, sweat on her brow. She held a tool in one hand and a broken chip in the other. Her fingers trembled as she removed the last piece of the tracker. Then the screen on the blocker turned green. "Signal dead," she whispered. Outside, Dan was breathing hard, hiding behind a tractor. Only 2 soldiers remained, and they were angry. He knew he couldn't beat them in a straight fight, but he didn't have to. He just had to stall them. He threw a metal part into the bushes, causing a noise. One soldier turned and stepped into a pit of sharpened spikes. The last one turned toward Dan, raised a glowing weapon, and suddenly froze. Kira had walked outside, holding the tracker chip in her hand. The red light on the chip flickered and died. The soldier tilted his head, confused. Without the signal, he couldn't identify her as a target. She was no longer Subject 7. She was no one. The soldier looked at Dan, then at Kira, then back again, and slowly backed away. He turned, walked toward the remaining craft, and vanished inside it. Seconds later, it lifted into the air and flew back to the mother ship above. The ship hovered for a moment, then left silently into the clouds. Dan lowered his shotgun, breathing hard. Kira fell to her knees, shaking. "It's over," she whispered. "They left." Dan helped her up. "For now," he said. "But they know Earth isn't silent anymore." She looked at him, eyes full of something new. Pride. You fought like one of us," Dan chuckled. "No," he said. "I fought like a farmer who got tired of watching people be treated like dirt." The sky was quiet again. The black ship was gone, and the air felt still, almost peaceful. But Dan knew the silence didn't mean safety. It meant they were watching from far above, deciding what to do next. Kira sat on the porch steps, her hands resting on her knees. The tracking chip lay broken beside her boots, nothing more than dead metal now. She wasn't a subject anymore, not a number, not a tool. She was just Kira. Dan stood in the field, watching the horizon. His farm was scorched, traps burned, fence posts shattered, but the house still stood, and the girl was still free. That was worth more than any crop or cow. The wind shifted suddenly, and a soft hum filled the air. Dan looked up, his heart sinking. A single small orb, round and silver, floated down from the sky. It stopped mid-air above the porch, blinking gently like it was alive. Kira stood slowly, her body tense. "It's a messenger drone," she said, her voice low. "They're not finished." The orb projected a beam of light, forming a figure, tall, thin, covered in golden armor. It wasn't real, just a hologram, but its presence felt heavy. It spoke in smooth, perfect English. "You have interfered with syndicate business," it said. "You have claimed property that is not yours." Dan narrowed his eyes, standing between the image and Kira. "She's not property," he said. "She's a person." The figure ignored him, continuing. "Return the subject voluntarily," it said, "and your land will be spared. Refuse, and this territory will be marked for reclamation." Kira's face turned pale. "That means invasion," she whispered. "They'll wipe out everything, not just the farm." Dan clenched his fists. He looked at the hologram and said slowly, "What happens if we don't return her and don't surrender?" The figure replied coldly, "Then Earth will be marked as hostile. No trade, no contact, no protection. You will be alone in the galaxy." Dan stepped forward, his voice firm. "Good," he said, "because we never asked for any of that." The image flickered for a moment, surprised. "You choose isolation?" it asked. Dan nodded. "I choose freedom," he said. "Hers, mine, and every damn human's." The drone paused, as if processing the choice. Then the light vanished, and the orb flew straight back into the sky. No explosion followed. No soldiers came. Just silence. Kira stood in shock. "You just told the syndicate no," she said. Dan gave a half smile. "Someone had to." She sat back down, shaking her head. "No one ever chooses the hard way," she whispered. "They always give in." Dan looked around at his damaged land, his ruined field, his burned traps. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe this time the hard way was the right way." 2 days passed, and nothing happened. No ships returned, no drones scanned the sky. The universe had gone quiet. But on the 3rd day, something unexpected appeared. A small shuttle, not syndicate, not human, landed in Dan's field without warning. Kira stared at it in disbelief. "That symbol," she said softly. "It's from a free planet, a rebel system." A female alien stepped out, dressed in green robes, peaceful and calm. She looked at Kira, then at Dan, and bowed slightly. "We saw the signal break," she said. "We knew someone had finally resisted." Kira walked forward slowly, unsure if it was a dream. "You're not from the syndicate?" she asked. The woman smiled. "No," she said. "We fight them." Dan crossed his arms, wary. "What do you want?" he asked. The woman looked at him with kind eyes. "To thank you," she said. and to offer her a home, if she chooses. Kira looked at Dan, unsure. He stepped closer and said, "It's your choice now, not theirs, not mine, yours." She swallowed hard, looked at the open ship, then back at the farmhouse. "I've never had a home," she said, "but this place, it felt like one." Dan gave her a soft smile. "It still can be," he said, "but if you want to see more, learn more, I'll be here when you come back." Kira stepped forward, hugged him tightly. Her voice trembled as she said, "You gave me more than freedom," she whispered. "You gave me worth." She turned and walked toward the ship, but at the door, she stopped and looked back. "I'll come back," she said, "not as a fugitive, but as a friend." Then the ship lifted, slow and gentle, disappearing into the blue sky. Dan stood in the field, hands in his pockets, smiling to himself. The farm was quiet again, the battle over, but something had changed, not just on the land, but in the stars, because one human made a choice to protect a girl no one else would, and in doing so, he lit a fire that